What if everything you've been told about composting is only half the truth, and the real system behind it is far more precise, far more biological, and far more powerful than what most people ever realize? Because right now, somewhere in your backyard, a simple pile of organic waste is either quietly transforming into rich, living soil, or sitting completely inactive for months without any visible sign of life. And the most confusing part is this: both piles often look exactly the same from the outside. Same smell. Same color. Same texture. Nothing obvious changes in the early stages. But inside, the difference is massive. One pile is biologically active, generating heat, supporting millions of microorganisms, and continuously breaking down organic matter. The other is almost dormant, stuck in a low-energy state where decomposition is extremely slow. Most people never understand this difference. They assume composting is simply a matter of time. You collect waste, you pile it up, you wait, and eventually soil forms. But that explanation is incomplete. Composting is not a waiting process. It is a biological activation system that depends entirely on internal conditions, not external time. And this is where everything changes. Because inside agricultural science and soil microbiology, composting is not seen as slow or random. It is understood as a controlled ecosystem where microbial life determines speed, efficiency, and quality. And if that system is not activated correctly, even months of waiting will not produce meaningful results. So the real question is not how long does composting take. The real question is the biological system inside the pile actually active or not? Part 1. The deep misunderstanding of composting. In almost every home or garden, composting begins with the same method. Organic waste is collected from the kitchen. Dry leaves are gathered from the yard. Grass clippings are added after mowing. Sometimes garden trimmings, cardboard, or fruit peels are mixed in. Everything is combined into one pile with the expectation that nature will handle the rest. At first, this approach seems logical. It looks natural. It feels sustainable. But what most people don't realize is that simply mixing organic material does not guarantee decomposition. Inside that pile, a biological system must first become active before any meaningful breakdown can begin. And activation does not happen automatically. It requires conditions. It requires balance. And most importantly, it requires microbial readiness. Without these conditions, organic matter does not transform. It simply sits in a slow biological state, waiting for the environment to change. This is the first hidden truth. Composting is not automatic. It is conditional. Balance Scale Part 2. The Invisible Biological Control System. Every compost system on Earth is controlled by a single biological principle: the balance between carbon and nitrogen. But to truly understand this, we need to go deeper than surface definitions. Carbon is not just brown material. It is structural energy storage. It provides stability, shape, and long-term fuel for microbial systems. It is slow to break down because it is chemically complex and tightly bound. Nitrogen is not just green material. It is biological activation energy. It is what allows microbial organisms to build proteins, reproduce, and expand their population. Now here is what makes this system powerful. Microorganisms are the real workers. Not humans. Not tools. Not time. Microbes are living systems that respond instantly to environmental balance. When carbon is too high, microbes cannot expand because they lack biological building material. When nitrogen is too high, the environment becomes unstable, toxic, and unstructured. But when both are balanced correctly, microbial life enters exponential growth. This is not linear growth. It is explosive biological expansion. And this is where decomposition speed is actually determined. Test Tube Part 3. The Hidden State of Inactivity. Inside a slow or inactive compost pile, something very important is happening that most people never observe. The system is not dead. But it is not active either. It is in what can be called a biological suspension state. Microorganisms exist in large numbers, but their behavior changes completely. Instead of growing rapidly, they slow down their reproduction cycles. Instead of expanding, they conserve energy. This happens because the environment does not support acceleration. So the system enters a maintenance mode. In this state, decomposition still technically exists, but at such a slow rate that it becomes almost invisible to the human eye. This is why people believe composting is slow by nature. But in reality, it is not slow. It is inactive. And inactivity is not a time problem. It is a biological imbalance problem. Fire Part 4, the activation phase. Now imagine a completely different compost pile. Same materials. Same environment. But this time, carbon and nitrogen are properly balanced. The moment this balance is achieved, microbial behavior shifts instantly. Dormant microorganisms become active. Reproductive cycles begin. Population density increases rapidly. And as microbial activity increases, something very important begins to happen. Heat is generated. But this heat is not external. It is metabolic energy released through biological processing. At this stage, composting stops being a passive pile of waste. It becomes a living biological reactor. A self-sustaining system that continuously processes organic matter without human intervention. And this is where time begins to lose importance. Because biological speed replaces waiting. Thermometer Part 5. Why heat is a critical signal of life. Heat inside a compost pile is not random. It is a biological signature. It tells us that decomposition is actively happening at a microbial level. As microbial activity increases, temperature rises. This rise in temperature triggers multiple biological effects. Pathogens begin to die naturally. Complex plant fibers soften and break apart. Organic structures become easier to digest for microbes. But heat alone cannot sustain composting. Without oxygen, the system cannot maintain aerobic conditions. And without aerobic conditions, efficiency drops dramatically. Wind Face Part 6. Oxygen as the engine of compost speed. Oxygen is one of the most misunderstood parts of composting. Most people think turning compost is just mixing material. But in reality, turning is an oxygen injection process. When compost is turned, oxygen penetrates deeper layers of organic matter. This oxygen fuels aerobic bacteria, which are the most efficient decomposers in nature. Aerobic bacteria are fast, stable, and highly productive. They generate heat. They break down complex material efficiently. And they prevent stagnation. Every time oxygen enters the system, microbial activity resets and accelerates again. Without oxygen, compost becomes slow, dense, and inefficient. Warning Part 7. Why most compost systems fail. Even with knowledge, composting failure is extremely common. Because biological systems are sensitive. Very small imbalances create large consequences. Excess nitrogen creates odor and instability. Excess carbon slows down microbial reproduction. Too much water blocks oxygen flow completely. Too little moisture stops microbial activity entirely. Uneven distribution creates inactive zones inside the pile. These inactive zones are the hidden reason behind slow composting. From outside, everything looks fine. But internally, only parts of the system are active. This creates false perception of failure. Seedling Part 8. Composting as Earth's natural recycling system. Composting is not a human invention. It is Earth's fundamental recycling system. Every ecosystem depends on it. Forests recycle nutrients through leaf decay. Grasslands regenerate soil through seasonal decomposition. Natural ecosystems never accumulate waste. Everything is continuously recycled. Without decomposition, life cannot sustain itself. Composting is simply a controlled version of this natural system. But with accelerated efficiency and human management. Globe showing America's Part 9. What happens when this system is broken? In modern systems, organic waste is often removed instead of returned to soil. This creates imbalance in the natural nutrient cycle. Soil loses organic matter. Microbial diversity declines. Plant growth becomes dependent on artificial fertilizers. But fertilizers only replace nutrients temporarily. They do not rebuild biological systems inside soil. Composting restores what industrial systems remove. It rebuilds microbial ecosystems. It improves soil structure. It restores long-term fertility cycles. Part 10. The shift in human perception. Once composting is understood deeply, perception changes completely. Waste is no longer waste. It becomes biological potential. Organic material is no longer useless. It becomes future soil. And decomposition is no longer decay. It becomes transformation. This shift is not just scientific. It is psychological. Because it changes how humans see natural systems. Seedling final part. The real truth behind composting. Composting was never slow. It only appears slow when biological systems are not understood correctly. But when conditions are balanced, microbial life activates instantly. Heat builds naturally. Oxygen accelerates breakdown. Organic matter transforms continuously. And waste becomes soil at a much faster rate than most people believe. Because composting is not waiting. It is controlled biological transformation. And when biology is controlled correctly, time stops being the limitation. Composting was never actually a slow process. It only appears slow when the biological system inside it is not properly understood or correctly balanced. But the moment conditions are aligned, carbon, nitrogen, moisture, oxygen, and microbial life working in harmony, the entire system changes its behavior completely. Microorganisms activate rapidly, heat builds naturally, and decomposition stops being a passive waiting process. It becomes a continuous biological transformation where organic matter is broken down, rebuilt, and converted into stable soil in a much shorter time than most people expect. And this is the real truth most people never realize. Composting is not about time. It is about control of biology. Because when biology is controlled correctly, nature no longer feels slow. It becomes extremely efficient. And what once looked like waste becomes the foundation of new life. Composting only appears slow because most people unknowingly run an inactive system rather than an active biological process. Inside every pile, billions of microorganisms drive decomposition, but their activity depends entirely on balance, especially the ratio of carbon, dry, brown materials that provide energy, to nitrogen, green, fresh materials that enable growth and reproduction. When this balance is off, microbes enter a low-energy survival mode, causing the pile to sit unchanged for months despite looking normal from the outside. But when conditions are correct, microbial populations multiply rapidly, generating heat through metabolism and turning the pile into a self-regulating biological reactor where decomposition accelerates dramatically. This process unfolds in stages, with fast-acting bacteria breaking down simple compounds first, followed by specialized organisms that handle tougher like cellulose and lignin, while factors like oxygen, moisture, and particle size determine efficiency. Turning the pile introduces oxygen that fuels high-performance aerobic microbes, proper moisture keeps life active without suffocating it, and smaller material sizes increase surface area for faster breakdown. If any of these elements drift out of balance, too wet, too dry, too compact, or poorly mixed, the system slows or shifts into inefficient anaerobic decay, often producing foul odors instead of the clean, earthy smell of healthy compost. When managed correctly, however, the transformation is complete. Raw organic waste restructures at a microscopic level into stable humus that stores nutrients, retains moisture, and rebuilds soil fertility over time. This mirrors the natural recycling systems found in forests and ecosystems, where organic matter continuously cycles back into the soil, meaning composting is not just waste management but a controlled form of regeneration. Turning discarded material into the foundation for future growth through precise biological activation rather than passive waiting.